Hello and welcome to episode 21 of Afrikanists Assemble. This month, we ask our contributors for their opinions on the highly debated topic of language revitalization. Here's the question we posed to them. Let's pretend that you've been offered a sizable grant to revitalize a single African language. Do you accept it? If not, why? If so, what language do you choose and what initiatives do you create? Here's what they answered.
Ọ bụrụ na enye m nnukwu ego ọrụ ntụtegharị asụsụ, aga m eji obi aṅụrị nabata ya ma were ya kwalite asụsụ na omenala Igbo. Igbo bụ asụsụ a na-asụ n'ọwụwa anyanwụ Naịjirịa nke dị n'ọdịda anyanwụ Afrịka. Ntụtegharị asụsụ dị mkpa n'ihi na obodo ọbụla asụsụ ha nwụrụ aghọọ na ndị nwụrụ anwụ. Nchepụta ọgụgụ isi m. Usoro m ga-agbaso na ntụtegharị asụsụ na omenala Igbo gụnyere ihiwe otu mụ na ha ga-arụ ọrụ ndị ọkachamara n'asụsụ Igbo, ịtụlegharị nchọcha ndị emere na ntụtegharị asụsụ, ịchọpụta ihe eme n'asụsụ Igbo ji agba ọnyụpa, ịgba ụmụ akwụkwọ, ndị nne na nna, ndị nkụzi, ndị ntorobịa na ndị ọzọ ga-ajụjụ ọnụ, ime ka ndị nwe asụsụ mara uru asụsụ ha bara site n'ịgwa ha okwu n'ọgbakọ dị iche iche, ịzụtasị ngwa eji arụ ọrụ ma ime nchọcha ma ịkụzi ihe, ịtụgharị akwụkwọ ndị edere n'asụsụ ndị ọzọ gaa n'asụsụ Igbo, ịchọtasị akwụkwọ ndị a ma hiwe otu ga-eme ntụgharị a, ịchọpụta, ikepụta na ichepụta aha nye mkpụrụ okwu ndị na-adịghị n'asụsụ Igbo, ịhazi asọmpi n'asụsụ na omenala Igbo n'ogo dị iche iche, ịgba egwu, ike ekike, isi nri, ime ejije, ịza gwam gwam gwam, ịtụ na ịzata ilu, ịkọ akụkọ ifo, asọmpi edemede dị iche iche ma nye ndị kacha mee nke ọma ihe nrita, ihiwe ọgbakọ nkụzi dị iche iche na ịzụgharị ndị nkụzi, itinye na ịkụzi asụsụ na omenala Igbo n'ikuku ịntanetị, YouTube, podcast, vidio dere gawa, ịga n'ọkpụ ụlọ ndị nwe asụsụ Igbo maka nkụzi na njem nlereanya, ime ka ndị ọrụ mgbasa ozi na TV na redio na ndị nta akụkọ ịdị na-agbasa ozi gbasara asụsụ na omenala Igbo, ibipụta mkpebi niile emere na nchọcha ndị a emere gbasara asụsụ na omenala Igbo, idekọta ma tinye n'ọkpụtụrụkpụ omenala Igbo dịka aka ọrụ, erimeri, ejiji, ekele, egwu dere gawazie ndị a ga-agbasa n'ikuku ka mba ụwa mata. Uru atụrụ anya ga-esi na ntụtegharị asụsụ Igbo pụta gụnyere ịkwalite asụsụ na omenala Igbo site n'inwe mmasị ịmụ, ịsụ, ịgụ na ide ya, inwe ọtụtụ akwụkwọ ebipụtara n'asụsụ Igbo, ime ka ụmụaka nwee mmasị n'asụsụ na omenala Igbo, inwe ọtụtụ ndị nkụzi bụ ọkaibe iji asụsụ Igbo akụzi sọbjekti niile, inye aka itinye n'ọrụ iwu gọọmenti ka iji asụsụ epum akụzi ihe site n'oge ọta akara ruo na praịmarị. Asụsụ Igbo ga-abụ nwa nwa tote ya etokwuru.
So if I am offered a sizable grant to revive one African language, the first thing is I must admit I'm going to be worried. Why am I limited to one if the grant is a sizable grant? And so, going by the demand, yes, I'll accept it. But I must admit that Africa is like a pot of so many languages, as we all might know. So many languages where so many are dying, so many are not valued even by the speakers themselves. So it will really be a bit confusing to choose just one to revive. But if I have to do this, if I am this limited, then I might not have to go far from home, of which I will go back to Cameroon. And the language I'll choose is the Cameroon Pidgin. Cameroon Pidgin to me is one beautiful language that shouldn't be seen the way it is being seen now. I want to do something that will make the speakers value this language more, to be able to use it more than they do now. Yes, it's really getting better as compared to the past, but I think so much needs to be done. And how could this be done? I think more books need to be translated. For Christians, the Bible also needs to be translated to Pidgin. We have this project actually. I know especially for the Catholic Church, they do have translated a Pidgin version of the Bible, but I think it's going to be expanded more if there is sizable size of funding like it's been offered here. I think more people will be employed to translate these Bibles, to write more books. Campaigns will be held where people will have to be encouraged to know how beautiful this language is, how important this language is, in order to be able to wipe away the mentality that some people have about Cameroon Pidgin. I think having this fund to do this will be very important. Even having to have people who go to secondary schools and let the young people, even the teachers, know, because I think the teachers, they need to be educated even more than the youth on how important this language is. What is just important is to know the boundary where what languages should be spoken. So if I am given this grant, I think it's going to be very helpful to do this. And before we all know it, Cameroon Pidgin will be making waves. And I think that will indirectly affect other countries that are also speaking Pidgin in a very positive light, where they might want to follow suit. So that's how I go about it.
I'm a linguist from Europe, an outsider. I wouldn't want to take initiatives to revitalize a language that is spoken by others. Vitalization can only come from within, from the speakers. It's even tricky and not very helpful if I give advice, but I can't help myself. The paradox in revitalization of a language is that the urge often comes too late, when it's no longer possible. No, I shouldn't say that. It's always possible. But when nearly all speakers have shifted to another language, it requires dedication, a very strong will to do so. I was asked to help the Yaku in Kenya because they wanted to keep their language. Some of my students, outsiders like me, tried to help. Fleur Wensheim produced a booklet to teach Yaku in primary schools. Geertje Heikoop rewrote the articles by Bernd Heine on Yaku into a grammar book in a language that is accessible to the teachers. These were for sure useful products, but the only way to let the language live is when it is spoken and when speakers feel at home in the language. One of the Yaku elders who still spoke a bit of the language and who was dedicated to help to preserve it was blocked by his own purism. He could not speak at natural pace because he was aware of all the Maasai words that came to mind. Speakers need to liberate themselves from that, to speak freely and to claim it's the original language, even if the linguistic documenter wants to catch the original old form of the language that once was. So I would not accept the money and suggest to invest the money in initiatives in bilingual communities that still speak the language that needs revitalization. And in particular, I would advise to give money to initiatives to propagate children's games in that language in preschool and to produce modern songs and theater in the language and distribute them through YouTube.
If I am offered a grant to revitalize an African language, I would definitely accept it with gratitude. Of course, the language to work on will be my mother tongue. My mother tongue is called Eloyi. Some call it Afo or Jiri. It is endangered in that there are fewer people speaking it today. It suffers from the colonial pressure of Hausa language, which is now widely spoken in my place. It also suffers from the pressures of modernity and foreign religions, such as Islam and Christianity. You want to know my initiatives? My first initiative is to create an orthography. a system of writing for the language. I will then create teaching materials that can be used to teach the language in basic schools within the region. There will be a section dedicated to documenting Eloyi oral literature and heritage. A crucial component will be for the translation of literary works from other languages to Eloyi so that people in Eloyi land can enjoy literatures written in different parts of the world, and that will enrich the language. I will take advantage of the new media as well by creating a YouTube channel for teaching and speaking Eloyi. There are many others that I will do, which time will not permit me to mention here.
Nwaike agala ewo na gamo na yami eti kukutanya ejimisu nini nimi kin Afrika na miago chiga ejimisu yan Nupe kuta. Nupe nchiji yi egi mimo nchiji na fikin tachiyan Nigeria na. Dokwa ji fikiyan Niger State o. Sashi mo fikiyan Kwara, Kogi to ejiko tachiyan Nigeria chi FCT. Daga nan sisan tuyan ejimisu nana yamide ajimbe eza naje tuna to eza naje kmiuna gbarufuji yentugiji to nusaji kami alade yegboro ebo eti kukutanya ejimisu Nupe nanobo. Bedzo mi keba be gbarufuji to yentugiji tile mi awa komiti na eza chiwonchi etu Nupe Alhaji Yaya Abubakar CFR la shishi nimi eyagba chatu guobe gutana eti wuwu to pinpinyan Nupe ona. Nana yebo mi wa yeda biayin eti amfani jimbe takadaji na aka ebo wuwu to pinpinyan Nupe nimi makanta jona. Nimi takada munchijo yi pirima woro yan Nupe eyagba chatu guobe gumi. Takada yan JB Adams na gaga eti pinpin to yi yan bekiji to kendo na ayi eganji yina Ekpo mofari to bachi eyagba chatu guobe gumi. Mi awa gan mi ji amfani be takadaji yin be zasan yan eza wangi na fe gagan be mi Nupe na. Ebo mo pinpin to wuwu Nupe onlu dashin ya pata. Ebo gabo amfani jimbe zasen kami yan echaba yan pinpin to kami na ji lami tu pata na. Gangan ni be tun lo be Android phone ji ko tablet ji ko computer ji wan lugwa egan na ji fi takada wunchijo na ga de kukuta wangi maga fe na kan sanya pinpin to wuwu yan Nupe ya egi makanta ji na ji fi makanta echabo to yan bacho na. Ya nusaji na eta Nupe wangi yina to eza na je pinpin na. Mi anje amfani be radio na yi radio yan zakama na. Mi awa be nusaji na abe emi radio na ebo afe abazaji fe chin echinji fe gagan eti aladaji to enyan dondo na de ajimbe yijele yan Nupe nchiji na. Ebo mo nlu fe eye lo yan pinpin yan Nupe to na kansan ya eza naji la gan Nupe wo sereyana to eza naji ewa gan akmiuna. Ebo gabo Nwaike mien de ewo na gama dan gwami bona amfani jimbe zasan yan zawangi na fe gangan na wan din ankali yan gbarufuji to yentugiji be kmi Nupe. Kanga izabaji to egangbiji lo ba nusaji gani be amfani jimbe radio yan zakame Kafe kpandaranya eyeloyan Nupe to amfani ya egidze kangiji yegboro.
The language I would choose to revitalize would be my own language, Yoruba. Yoruba is an interesting case because it is a major language on the African continent, and yet it's in decline, especially as you have fewer and fewer young people over the years speaking it as a first language. English is now is becoming the dominant language, and so I would set up language institutes, which would serve as one-stop shops where people could come and learn the language at any level, whether you are someone who knows nothing in the language, whether you are someone who grew up understanding and hearing the language at home but are not able to speak, or if you're someone who speaks the language to a native proficiency and degree, has no problem operating in the language except you're not able to read and write. It would be a place that Nigerians could come and learn and improve their language skills, engage with their culture without shame. I think there's a lot of shame and expectations placed on people, on Nigerians in particular, for learning their own language, for what they should know and despite what they may not know. And so I think a language institute would go a long way to making it accessible to anybody at any level. If we want to learn French, we know that you need to go to the Alliance Française. If you want to learn German, you know you need to go to the Goethe Institute. But unfortunately, a lot of people that I've spoken to don't feel like that option exists for their own language. And so my goal with the Language Institute would be to kind of rewrite that and change that. It would also be a space to really teach young kids. I think having new speakers, they are the ones that can really learn the language to a deep level. So to really engage children, have Saturday schools and fun cultural activities. I would also want to train teachers and bring in that language acquisition expertise. I think one of the legacies of colonialism was this idea that learning your language takes place solely at home, that it's kind of a domestic activity. It's not something that you need to go to school for. And yet we spend all this time learning mathematics, learning French, learning other things, but we don't devote that same time to our own languages. And so this kind of institute would go a long way to showing that you get what you invest and the returns are there if you put in the work. And so really raising a new crop of language professionals, providing grants and scholarships in the universities for people who study Yoruba at the university level, and also engaging language engineers who could add new words into the lexicon that people can use as more and more people are learning the language. I think revitalizing our languages starts with us. It starts with us making it more accessible and easy for us to engage.
This is a great question, and it's one that, when I consider it, really reminds me that I'm not a linguist. I've studied only a couple of African languages, and my work is mainly in literature. So, it's with admiration that I leave the question with my colleagues who are better prepared for it and adjust it just a little. And what I want to say is that there is a language I fantasize about reviving, and this is really a fantasy, and that is the Swahili of the 19th century. Probably I should say Swahilis, plural. And in those Swahilis, Kimvita and Kiamu especially, the Swahili of Mombasa and the Swahili of Lamu, and especially poetry in those varieties of Swahili in the 19th century. So really, I want to think of poetry in Kimvita and Kiamu as particular languages, poetry languages. And on one hand, I fantasize about recreating the performance and sharing contexts in which people presented poems and circulated them. And on the other, I fantasize about restoring a sense of linguistic context, exactly how, in the worlds of 19th century Mombasa and Lamu, did the language of poetry exist alongside the language of the everyday, with some overlap, but not a total overlap. What was that like exactly from day to day? When Muyaka bin Haji in Mombasa began to write his poems that used Kimvita as a literary language, but also drew on his knowledge of a poetic tradition centered in Kiamu to the north, what was Muyaka hearing in his everyday life? And what did his poems sound like in that context? And for Zaidi Mgumi in Lamu, in the translation collective that I have the good fortune of being part of now, that works on some of his shorter poems, I dream of recovering the moments and the occasions and events in which those poems were performed and shared. And here I say recover rather than revitalize, because there is today a vibrant culture of poetry in Lamu. The poet Ustad Mao, who is in the Zaidi Mgumi collective, is an active and important poet, for example. And with recovery, I think there is a way that through the local expertise of intellectuals in Lamu, and the expertise also of linguists outside of Lamu, and the expertise of members in our translation collective, maybe one could, with a sizable grant, as the question says, have a go at recreating the occasions and contexts in which the poems might have been read and or recited or performed.
If I am given a grant to revitalize or revive a particular language, I will first consider the causes of the language loss, the causes of the language erosion or the language shift or the language death, as the case may be. What has engineered, what has motivated, what has impacted on the use of that language? In present times, particularly where I come from, I speak Loko. Loko is a language spoken by the Akko people from Cross River region, the southern part of Nigeria. But as I speak to you, in recent times, children have been seen to use the English language more than using the Loko language. And the reason is quite simple: urbanism, metropolitanism. Every child wants to be seen and recognized as someone who is urbanized, even if he has never been to the urban areas. And even parents are seen to feel that their children have to fit in when other children from urban areas come visiting the villages. And so these children gradually are not seen using the language, and it causes erosion because it's language shift. Recently, academics have decried that these languages are gradually dying. As a linguist, I will want to, revitalize that language. And there are various means of revitalizing the language. First, I will make sure that the local radio channels, radio stations, TV channels involve this language in its use daily, so that the children who pay attention to TV and the radio will be able to pick words from these radio stations, from these TV stations, and it could become part of their lives. Again, we may also make sure that the language is codified. I have discovered that the language has not been adequately codified, and this can also lead to its erosion. So if the language is written, either the Bible religious text or literary text, it can also aid in its development. It will also aid in its revival, as it were. Bilingual programs also in schools, where some of the subjects like mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and other important courses can be taught in the language. So children don't have to go to schools where they will say vernacular is highly prohibited. There should be an official statement. There should be a policy emphasizing for bilingual programs so that the language can stay. So when children are taught in English and also in their vernaculars, in their languages, these people will understand that these languages have come to stay. They won't have to abandon one for the other in order to be seen and known as people who are metropolitan in their speaking, in their speech, because English has been associated to metropolitanism. These are the many ways I think that can be done.
Idan na samu wadataccen kuɗin bincike domin inganta harshe ɗaya cikin harsunan nahiyar Afirka, to lalle zan karɓa kuma zan ɗauki harshen Hausa a matsayin harshen da zan yi bincike domin inganta shi. Akwai dalilai da dama akan wannan matsayi nawa. Da farko, harshen Hausa harshe ne da ke da masu amfani da shi da yawansu ya kai miliyoyin jama'a tun daga arewacin Najeriya har zuwa sauran makwabtan ƙasashe. Harshe ne da ya yi zarra da fifiko akan sauran harsuna duk da halin ko'in kula da ake nuna a kansa. Abin nufi a nan, babu wani abu daga ɓangaren gwamnati ko sauran hukumomi da ake yi domin inganta harshen. Harshen na ci gaba ne kawai da kansa ba tare da wasu dabarun inganta shi ba. Kai, hatta ranar Hausa da masana suka ware a shekara domin girmama wannan harshe, babu wani abun a zo a gani daga ɓangarorin shugabancin ƙasar Hausa. Ba sarakuna ba kuma gwamnonin ba. Wani abin takaici ma shine 'ya'yan shugabanni da sauran manyan jami'an gwamnati ke nuna rashin amincewa da harshen Hausa. Da yawan sukan nuna fifiko ga harshen Ingilishi, musamman a cikin taro idan suna magana. Amma kamar yadda Bahaushe ke cewa, kayan aro abin banza ne. Wannan halayya tasu bata hana miliyoyin masu amfani da harshen su yi ba, tare da kuma nuna alfahari da harshen. Idan na samu damar amfani da kuɗi domin ƙarfafa wani harshe, to lallai Hausa za ta sha daɗi. Domin kuwa zan yi ƙoƙari fito da tsare-tsare da bukukuwa domin karrama waɗanda suka yi wa harshen hidima, tun daga masana har zuwa marubuta da mawaƙa da masu sarrafa harshe a cikin hikima. Wannan zai ƙara fito da harshen a duniya, sannan ya ƙara jawo masa kula daga sassa daban-daban na duniya. Shirye-shirye na ba za su tsaya a cikin manyan 'yan boko da mutanen birane kawai ba. A'a, zan shiga lungu-lungu, saƙo-saƙo domin binciko hanyoyin da Hausawa, musamman mazauna karkara da ƙauyuka, ke sarrafa harshen. Wannan zai ƙara fito da hikima da nuna dabarun harshen, musamman waɗanda ba su gurɓata ba ta hanyar cakuɗuwa da sauran harsuna da al'adu. Waɗannan da sauran shirye-shirye ne zan tsara idan na samu kuɗin bincike domin inganta harshen nahiyar Afirka guda ɗaya. Na gode.
Let me begin by reading from two poems. First one is titled Pidgin Soup. Make I talk, make una hear. Say pidgin stew dey sweet. The sweet pass all dem hot grammar. E fit hold big man belle, make am laugh like choke, till you fit see im trouser comot. E fit make better woman sef to like tori pass wallet. She go fall for ground to jolly, laugh like who win lotto. Ha! Pidgin na like flute. You fit put am for your mouth, sweet like wetin call, just dey sing, dey go. That poem is taken from Maarten Mous. I will ask questions with stones if they take my voice. The second poem is titled Sex Change. It is taken from Akachi Adimora Ezigbo's Dancing Mask. One time wey I dey Oyibo country, I come see something wey full my eye. The thing come surprise me no be small. Even self I never recover, I still dey for shock. I dey look as one fine Oyibo woman dey come talk how im go do sex change 2 times. That day I hear say you fit be man today, tomorrow you fit become woman. Imuibe, my people, this one pass me. If I were given a sizable grant to revitalize a single African language, I would elect the West African Pidgin, also called the Guinea Coast Creole English. This language is well spoken by over 75 million people across Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, Sierra Leone, and Equatorial Guinea. The West African Pidgin is highly lexified by English and other local African languages and has been adopted as the language for commerce, business, and trade. This language is also spoken by politicians, preachers, musicians, actors, actresses, and writers in their daily engagement with society. In this sense, the West African Pidgin has remained a much easier way of communicating with a large number of people who are not just in West Africa but across the world. If I were to create an initiative to revitalize the West African Pidgin English, I would focus on a comprehensive enumeration, collation, and interpretation of the lexicons which are derived from the local African languages into a collective whole, a dictionary, so as to improve on the meaning and understanding of each entry and its local flavor. This is no doubt an attempt to formalize, or if you like, to standardize its orthography and extend its semantic implications beyond national boundaries. This also would give room for translation studies.
Well, my answer to the question is really quick and simple. I would never accept a grant to revitalize a single African language or any African language because I'm European. I'm an European woman. I have no knowledge of the languages, no concrete and deep knowledge of the languages spoken on the continent, and this would be a repetition of a colonial attitude.
If I were to pretend that I was offered a sizable grant to revitalize a single African language, would I accept it? Oh, you bet. I would accept it with my two hands and set off the National Institute for the Promotion of African Languages. But in particular, I would use the sizable amount of money to promote the Yoruba language. The reason being that Yoruba language is not only spoken in Nigeria, but is also spoken in the diaspora. It's spoken in places like Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago. It's spoken even in the neighboring countries like Togo and all the other places, even I think as far as Ghana as well. So I would choose this language because the grant would revitalize the language and it would help in the promotion of the linguistic diversity of a language like Yoruba and its cultural preservation, not only for Nigeria, but for the continent. And it would ensure generations have access to the rich cultural heritage of the Yoruba language. So having said that, the Institute will promote other African languages as well, but my focus will be strictly on the Yoruba language. And the reason being that we don't have governments that help in the promotion of African languages, just like we have for Chinese or Japanese or even the German language. We don't have such government support for our languages, either at home or in the diaspora. And so the Institute for the Promotion of African Languages, with particular bias for Yoruba language, will be to create new narratives, not only for those who just want to study the language so that they can do research, but in a way that they can also understand the worldview of Yoruba people and how some of the things Yoruba people do can contribute to the development of the world. I do not need to repeat again that the Ifa corpus was the foundation of a binary that eventually became the computer. The 0101 is the basis of the Ifa corpus and geomancy. So there are so many things that the world can learn from Yoruba, but we just need to change the narrative. We just need to reach out to the different segments of society and not think that once we get on to students, then we're getting across to everybody. It's going to be a different narrative for government policymakers. It's going to be a different one for the policymakers of higher institutions. It's going to be a different message to students themselves and to the parents of the students. And then we can begin to think of the general populace. I tell you, there's so much that can be done if we allow the Yoruba language to receive the right kind of promotion it deserves. Kojubelo, Abiba Olesherisi.
Hivi majuzi nilipata kujua kuhusu mradi mmoja wa shirika la Mozilla linaloitwa Sauti ya Jamii. Mradi huu unatengeneza na kujenga hifadhi data ya Kiswahili na kufunza mashine kuelewa lugha hiyo ya Kiswahili. Nawapongeza Mozilla kwa kubuni mradi huu. Juhudi hizi za Mozilla zimenifanya kuwaza kuhusu mengine mengi yanayohitajika kuhifadhi lugha zingine za Kiafrika. Nasema hivi kwa sababu Sauti ya Jamii inagusia tu Kiswahili ambayo ni lingua franca. Je, zile lugha zingine za Kiafrika takriban 2000 ambazo kadha tayari ziko hatarini kupotea? Kwa hivyo, ningekumbatia ruzuku ya kufufua lugha ya Kiafrika kwa mikono miwili. Ila swali gumu ni kuchagua lugha ipi haswa nitakayoilenga na ruzuku ya aina hii. Mradi nilioutaja, Sauti ya Jamii, hupokea michango kutoka kwa wanaojitolea kujenga hifadhi data kwa lugha ya Kiswahili kupitia njia mbili. Moja, mchangiaji anaweza kusoma sentensi zilizoko kwa anwani ya tovuti ya commonvoice.mozilla.org na kuziwasilisha kwenye hifadhi. Njia ya pili ni kusikiliza sentensi zilizosomwa na kisha kuthibitisha usawa wake. Aidha, Kiswahili kinachozingatiwa hapa ni Kiswahili sanifu, asili yake kubwa ikiwa ni Kiunguja. Hii ina maana kwamba utumizi wa lahaja zingine kama Kiamu na Kimvita unadidimia kwa kasi sana. Jambo ambalo ningelifanya na ruzuku ya kufufua lugha ni kuupanua mradi kama huu wa Mozilla, huu mradi wa Sauti ya Jamii, ugusie hizo lahaja zingine. Kuna kazi nyingi za fasihi zilizobuniwa kutumia lahaja zingine ambazo wazungumzaji wa Kiswahili sanifu hawawezi kuzielewa kikamilifu. Pia, kuna waandishi wengi hasa washairi ambao bado wanatumia lahaja za Kiamu na Kimvita, lakini kazi zao hazipatiwi kipaumbele na watafiti kwa sababu watafiti wengi huwa wanatumia Kiswahili sanifu. Kwa hivyo, ningetaka kupanua mradi kama huu wa Mozilla kuangazia zile lahaja zingine. Kwa maana, kujumlisha lahaja hizi itatupa fursa kuenzi Kiswahili kikamilifu, kuelewa fasihi zilizobuniwa kwa lahaja tofauti tofauti na kuhifadhi na kukuza lahaja ambazo zinapotea. Asante.
A couple of days ago, I heard the story of a teacher who punished one of his pupils for using an indigenous language in the classroom, which he called vernacular. Whereas the Nigerian language policy spells that learners should be taught in the language of their immediate environment during their formative years of learning. This is a form of language revitalization process. I ask, how effective, how efficient, and how reliable is this process? If I'm offered a sizable grant to revitalize a single African indigenous language, I will turn down the offer. This is because some of the factors which have silenced African languages are still very effective today. Factors such as power relations, imperialism, dynamism of language, colonialism, neocolonialism, and the likes. Again, the process of standardizing and selecting a particular variety over others can be tasking, and most times can lead to the death of other varieties when one is selected. Take for instance, in Igbo language, nli, nri, and nni all mean food. When a particular variety is selected, other varieties may risk going into extinction. Again, approaches to language revitalization such as school-based approach, home-based approach, documentation, language planning, and a whole lot of others all have their loopholes and may not effectively actualize the process of language revitalization.
Development of monolingual African language to revitalize a single African language is possible and can be maintained. Since the reason for the predominance of the European language in the official and the educational sphere of most African countries after regaining political independence was the view that countries should have one national language in order to achieve national integration and unity. The European language was ostensibly retained as a neutral language, since the multilingual nature of African countries will have made the choice of one language above the other to be problematic. Still, this English that is brought to us by the European can also be domesticated to suit the African expression, like our proverb, myth, etc. English language is the best language which can be used and which can be domesticated to suit the African audience, since the writers are also Africans. Then the English language is the best language to be used or turned into the African language.
A misalin da an bani kuɗi mai yawa domin in taimaka inganta wata harshe a Afrika, za ni zaɓi harshen Hausa domin ita ce yaren da an fi yi a Afrika ta Yamma zuwa Afrika ta Tsakiya. Mabiye da haka, mutane sama da miliyan 50 suna amfani da wannan harshen a fannin kasuwanci, siyasa da maganganu gaba ɗaya. Littattafan soyayya na cikin Hausa suna nan da dama, kuma su fim na Hausa da ake kiransu Kannywood suna nan da dama domin mutane na siyan su. Masujadai ko na Krista ko na Islam a arewacin Najeriya suna amfani da littattafan Hausa fiye da sauran yaruka. Sabili da haka, zan zuba damin kuɗin nan domin a yi juyi na sanannen littattafan duniya kamar na William Shakespeare, Margaret Atwood da Ngugi wa Thiong'o zuwa ga Hausa. A bisani kuma, zan zuba damin kuɗin a wurin juyin science da technology zuwa ga Hausa domin mutane su sani a wani harshe na kusa, ba lallai sai Turanci ba.
Since Hans-Jürgen Sasse's seminal chapter on language death, published in 1991, we know that many factors play a role when a language dies. The so-called external setting, including political and economic factors, triggers a process in the course of which the speaker's linguistic behavior changes and they decreasingly use their language. The process is accelerated if language ideologies additionally prioritize languages spoken by the regional or national majority. If speakers do not see any value in speaking their language, if they are denigrated or laughed at when they do so, they speak it less, and this can ultimately affect the structure of the language and its decay. In other words, external, behavioral, and structural factors are inextricably connected with each other. I am therefore not convinced that revitalization of a language is a promising undertaking. Sociolinguists and linguists can study the phenomenon to understand how the different factors interact. They can help develop an orthography, for instance, or transcribe texts. For most, they can raise awareness in the speakers' communities about the intertwining factors that contribute to the language decay. But I don't think they can ward off the process which has its roots in the societal, economic, and political realm, which go far beyond the linguist's competences.
Yes, I will accept the grant, and I will choose my indigenous language, which is Yoruba language. There's a wrong assumption that Yoruba language is not as endangered as other indigenous Nigerian languages. I will say it is rather more endangered because of its exposure to civilization. The Yoruba tribe is one of the major tribes in Nigeria and the most receptive to foreign religion, education, and cultures. There's currently a huge decline in the teaching and engagement with Yoruba language than it used to be. An average Yoruba indigene cannot construct a complete Yoruba sentence without code switching to English, slang, Pidgin, or any other language he or she is exposed to. Many cannot even read or write in Yoruba language. Language revitalization entails bringing back and strengthening endangered or dormant languages. So to carry out this task, I will carry out a range of musical activities, music being my area of specialty, that will promote and increase the use of Yoruba language. And this will include the documentation of indigenous Yoruba songs, especially the folk songs, which is enriched with the proverbs, idiomatic expression, and history of the Yoruba people. The teaching of the language also will be done through music and other supportive resources that will be available. Finally, a structured engagement with the urban communities and schools through cultural musical events will be carried out to create awareness of the importance of the language and its sustainability. Thank you.
Let's pretend that I've been offered a sizable grant to revitalize a single African language. I would say that it is important when I'm thinking about promoting an African language. The African language of my choice would be Gikuyu, which is my mother tongue. So my answer is absolutely yes, I would accept the grant. And there are two ways in which I would, or two initiatives that I would put in place in helping to promote the language, that is Gikuyu language. The first one is I would collect stories, that is anthologies for pleasure reading, starting with young readers. And then I would develop and advance this from junior series to senior levels up to university level. And therefore, this kind of literature would be accessible to young readers as well as adults, and also people that are interested in literatures in African languages. The second initiative, and that is the reason why I have said I would accept this grant, is that this grant would be used in creating and developing podcasts. And in this podcast, I would produce literary conversations in Gikuyu language around or based on different subjects and themes. In these podcasts, we would have subjects or themes related to politics, culture and society, as well as, issues to do with the environment and contemporary issues. At the same time, I would invite different people or speakers from the language and who would come to give a proverb and then give its meaning. We can also have book reviews, and even if these books are written in another language, for instance, English, we can translate them into Gikuyu language. So this is now a third point whereby translation would make other writings or other works that have been authored in other languages, let's say English, Swahili, and so on, to be accessible to readers through this platform. So that is my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Ahamwe mere lui inlomo osu uro esa ide mumi ikirori rolo sa agba eva ohehe no ribohi akika ni elwebe osi uwa nokoto bio no riba desese bio no kokun akinetalo akigwanu wede nare twen ebarelwe esan okun ye bi ibare gbonle oboto akigwanu wede bona mi uru kekeribi esan boto esan akigwanu wede nare gwanu popa nahare gbesa nahare lwe esan agmoye mama zesan uru esan oye mama tebo nareze oibo olekize andori ahazo ibo egerewegen oki haji uru no sole oni zena damie uru no sesan akikiki robole wikeke na remie alweole akiyi kolo keke osuwa ohun osuwa no riwade sese bi osuwa no koto na remie ebare halwe san ye ebare hare san gbemi ye ake keke tali ake gbehamabo ramude uro no soria ole oria ria okwelwemi ahamie we ruru no seria we da saboria no pionlege me san gbembe esana regbembe oiwo mama me ramude ode gamie i ohano rivesan itano rivesan ebe no rivesan aki sabo gbeno leoboto nibo hande sema ne leone uro no soria ole ebe nevo ne kanye onevo ni ebere nye ye eke oruru oye ege kise nyese eke uro no sele oye oni la kire mwegbe ni arelembe arenye ye wege yalo oni zeni madame uro esa aki rubobo no se bege aremie aki lwe oni zeni medama ma hagongon eki no mo mere no gbon sahamoni hu mesi medemumi iki woro olu no se bege adame uro no se san aki tun le ohun no ribe Egya ha zonoro bege adame boni arenyele vesa okise ye ririo hakya obolo.
If I were offered a sizable grant to revitalize a single African language, would I accept it? That is the question. I think my answer to that question is, of course, yes. I would like to accept it. And, of course, the language I'm going to choose is Okwani, one of over 450 Nigerian languages. Okwani is a language spoken by approximately 400,000 people, the Okwani people, found in 3 local government areas of Delta State. I will say that a lot of attempts have been made to codify and systemize its orthography, but there hasn't been any uniform orthography for this language. Unlike the languages spoken by these other ethnic groups that bound the Okwani, it hasn't got its own translation of the Bible translation of the New Testament, or even the entire Bible translation, which to a great extent sustains the codification and the alphabetization of the language. So currently, Okwani is an endangered minority and less described language. This is even made worse by the rapid development and expansion, of modernity, the encroaching arrival of modernity in this region owing to oil mining and dwindling number of native speakers who are increasingly adopting Pidgin and English as a mode of initiating and sustaining interaction with a growing number of non-Okwani people that have come from outside these 3 local government areas. So what we find is that young people are losing grip on their language. So if I had a grant, I would deploy the following initiatives. One is that I will assess the level of alphabetic description and identify ways of augmenting it, improving on what has been done, following strictly the scope and contents of the framework of the orthographies of Nigerian languages, which was published by the Nigerian Language Center in Lagos. So the second thing I would do is to commence the development of a lexicography. And then number 3, I will engage in language documentation. In fact, this is very important. Language documentation refers to the lasting and multi-purpose record of a language which borders on the compilation and preservation of the linguistic primary data of that language. In this instance, the Okwani. As a matter of urgency for me, I will begin my language documentation by collecting, processing, and archiving linguistic data such as texts, word lists, recordings of conversation, proverbs, stories, songs, tales, and legends, and many other literary works that embody the ideology of these people in order to have a complete documentation of the Okwani language.
Those were the responses we received from our contributors this month. What do you think about their thoughts? Did they come up with well-designed initiatives? Would you accept such a grant yourself? And if yes, which language would you choose? Tell us about it in the comments below. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Afrikanists Assemble. We post a new episode every month, so be sure to subscribe to see what other subjects we take on in the realm of African languages and literature.
I'm